Hello and welcome to Learning Curve, an exploration of what it means to teach and learn in the age of generative AI. I'm Jeff Young. Okay, this is the 8th episode of this podcast, and I think it's worth taking a minute to review some of what we've covered so far. In the first episode, we looked at how these new generative AI models think, or whatever they're doing, and how that is different than human thinking, and what that difference means for potential educational uses. On another episode, I visited a university campus, Duke University, and asked leaders why they're giving away AI tools to all their students and faculty. I heard some of the big hopes for those tools, but it was tempered with officials admitting they're pretty careful with how they communicate about this program to their faculty because they know some professors are wary of AI. And I've interviewed lots of students, including one Northeastern University student who demanded her money back when she found out her professor generated his teaching materials with AI without disclosing it. And for last week's episode, I teamed up with student journalists at the University of Minnesota. That's near where I live. And we talked to a bunch of undergrads about their feelings about AI. And many of them are frustrated by what they see as mixed signals that they're getting on campus, since a lot of their professors are banning AI use in assignments, while the university is giving students free access to Google Gemini. A big theme is that these AI tools are rolling out so fast that no one really knows the healthy and productive way to use them. Today, I wanted to step back and look at the big picture of higher education and how AI could play a role in either enhancing its effectiveness and its status or in going the other way. And for that, I decided to bring in a futurist. I admit I don't know a lot of futurists. I actually, just for fun, looked up the meaning of that profession on Google, and the Google AI summary said it is sometimes also called a horizon scanner. I hope that is true and not a hallucination, because I love that. I think we could all use a horizon scanner right now to look ahead and help see where this AI might be taking us in education. So I connected with futurist Brian Alexander, whose focus is on higher ed and scanning that horizon. He's a senior scholar at Georgetown University, and he is someone I've talked to many times over the years for my reporting, and we've hung out at education events. Oh, and he has a new book coming out, which is all about where higher ed is headed. It's called Peak Higher Education: How to Survive the Looming Academic Crisis. I realize as I say that title aloud, it sounds a little bit like a downer, but Brian is at heart a really hopeful guy. And as you'll hear, his hope is to wake folks up and get serious about understanding the stakes for the latest experiments with AI on campuses. After all, what's going on with student attitudes and how professors are using it or not, it's all going to help shape how effective colleges are and how they're perceived. Okay, so that's the context. Here are the highlights of my conversation with Brian Alexander. Before we get to AI, I want to first get a sense of your broader theory of peak higher ed. I think a lot of folks have heard of the demographic cliff. That's gotten a lot of attention. Maybe some listeners, if they're outside of higher ed, it won't have heard of it, but pretty much everyone in higher ed has been talking about the demographic cliff for a long time, which is this declining birth rates in the U.S. started during the Great Recession, and just by math and reality, there are just fewer high school graduates coming out of high school starting this fall by just how kids age. And then that means less potential students if, traditional college age students. But I was struck, your book makes it clear that this is not a demographic cliff only book. Like you're talking about a trend that's bigger. In fact, I believe you say that even before this demographic cliff hit, there were signs of falling enrollments and other signs that what you say peak higher ed might be coming. So why are we reaching potentially peak higher ed? Can you give us a quick kind of sense of the broader picture here?
Sure. This is a model based on, well, now it's historical because it simply happened. This is modeled based on two primary bits of data. One is the total number of enrollment at American colleges and universities, and the other is the total number of American colleges and universities as institutions. And it's pretty clear that from the early 1980s to about 2012, that both of those grew, especially enrollment just soared immensely. And then around 2012, we hit the peak. Enrollment declined from there until last year. It declined minutely but clearly for about 6 years. Down 1%, down 2% a year. Then during COVID, it took serious hits, depending on how you measure it, down 5 or 6%. But the key thing was coming out of COVID, we were significantly below where we were in 2012. And since then, we've had a slight rebound, almost entirely driven by non-traditional students.
So who are these non-traditional students he's talking about? You might have guessed returning adults trying to finish up their stalled degrees and maybe doing that online. But no, you have to think about younger students, much younger.
That is by dual enrollment students in community colleges. That means high school students.
High school students.
Primarily seniors taking extra classes at community colleges.
The number of dual enrollment students, these are high school students that take college classes while they're in high school, it has popped from 300,000 in the early 2000s to 2.5 million in 2022-23. That's 300,000 to 2.5 million in that short span of time. Minnesota, the state where I live, it was a pioneer of these dual enrollment programs. And I did an episode about this trend for my previous podcast, the EdSurge podcast. I'll link to that in the show notes. But for that, I visited a high school near me where students can take enough college credits during the high school day to get their 2-year college degree by the time they've finished high school. It's totally blurring this line between where high school stops and where college begins. Anyway, that is where tons of growth is in higher ed around the country these days.
Which was great news for community colleges because they were suffering really, really horribly for about 15 years in terms of enrollment. In terms of total institutions, the arc of American history is in part the growth of the number of post-secondary institutions. And that really grew in time with the enrollment boom. And sometimes it was development of institutions, that is colleges becoming universities, institutions growing. The total number also really peaked around then, and it's plateaued and declined a bit since then. It's really declined if you take into account for-profit institutions, which I do. So those are the two bases of the quantitative metrics that you can just point at and see, okay, that's objectively true. But I think along with those quantitative measures, we've also had a qualitative decline. And you can measure that in terms of American attitudes. And you and your listeners have seen, I'm sure, many examples of this in surveys from Gallup and from Pew and from others, but that Americans' attitudes towards higher education have declined. And I've heard this explained by academics as symptomatic of larger decline in American institutions as well. And there's some truth to that. We're definitely, especially since 2016, in a very anti-institutionalist mode. But I don't think that saves American higher education. The fact is that Americans are souring on it. We're seeing it as less valuable. We're seeing it less rewarding. And it depends, the surveys vary from year to year, depending which population expresses this view, depending on how the question is asked. But it's pretty clear that the decline has been pretty steady. And that is quantitative if we measure it in terms of, of respondents to a poll. But I think of that as in terms of a qualitative response where our attitudes towards this have really changed.
And I think it's interesting to me that has happened so fast, literally within the distance between when you and I went to college and now when, we have kids that have either gone through or are about to go through college. So in that span, these attitudes have shifted, right? I mean, that's been the bulk of the shift.
It's a huge snap, and it's the reason I spent time turning this into a book is because I think this is such a significant change in American higher education. It's one that isn't fully appreciated, especially outside of the academy. And the fact is that I started going to my undergraduate classes in 1985, and you're around the same time, I think.
Yeah.
And at that point, we were starting a boom. Clay Shirky referred to this as a golden age, where we just massively increased the number of students. And again, to your listeners, why this matters is for two main reasons. One is that the business model for American higher education is overwhelmingly student fees. So a handful of colleges and universities, a very tiny amount, have endowments that they can draw on. Some of them can rely on public funding to some extent, but over generally speaking, which the colleges and universities depend on student numbers in order to keep the doors open. So once those numbers go down, the problem is pretty clear. But the second reason is that we've had a cultural and political consensus until, again, around 2012, that the more college experience Americans get, the better.
Yeah, it was like a big access push. And the policy pushes were toward let's get as many people to college as possible. That's going to be the best answer.
And the first term Obama administration, I think, was the acme of this. And he mentioned this in his State of the Union addresses that we need to get as many people through as possible.
And we have to make college affordable for every American.
That was Barack Obama giving a State of the Union address 9 years ago. And you can't see this as a listener, but if you watch the clip on YouTube, you see just about every member of Congress in the room is clapping.
No hardworking student should be stuck in the red.
And this was a bipartisan consensus, Republican and Democrat alike. And you saw this from popular culture figures to federal policy to high school guidance counselors to state policies. And that idea of college for everyone is now is falling apart. And that breakup is one that I don't think is fully recognized. But clearly, Americans are voting with their feet. And I'm saying Americans. I'm not even including the large number of international students who come to the U.S. The Trump administration has this delusional idea that if we reduce the number of international students, somehow Americans would go flocking to those spots. It's simply not true. Where many colleges and universities are using international students to help keep the doors open. But I think that change in attitude is so important. And we can dig into some of the reasons why people are studying this now, but they're vital for understanding what's happening in American colleges and universities.
This is super interesting. I mean, obviously, I was in college myself in the 90s, in the mid 90s, but like I've been a big believer for my whole career and my whole life of like this deep belief that higher ed was this kind of most important institution, this hugely important institution, a bedrock of what so many other important things in our society kind of like grow out of or get helped by, whether that's employment or citizenship or, basically innovation, which has been a big focus of what I've looked at in my career too, of like that this was all like and research improvements, like just making our collective lives better kind of came out of higher ed in so many different ways. And it seems like these are the many things the universities have done. It's all packaged together. Typically, you mentioned the for-profits. There is exceptions of institutions that don't do research or the community colleges. But, overall, higher ed has done these many different factors of like, there's liberal arts, there's employment, kind of the things that you need to know for your job. There's research, like I said, and then there's both the basic research and the research, like training future researchers. So all these things, it seems like just to say what's at stake, like what's at stake if, obviously you're partly what you're saying is these things are already happening, but you're also looking at if that was the peak, if we pass the peak, what are the implications? What does it mean in your view?
Well, I share your passion for the sector. I mean, this is, we've both devoted our lives to it. And I think it's important to state that, especially in a very politicized environment. And what's at stake is, first of all, is the financial sustainability of much of higher education. And, and some of your listeners will know, I've been tracking cuts, closures, and mergers for American higher education, which have been flowing steadily, really since 2008. And there's a simple economic case to be made. If you have fewer students, or if the students you have are paying less because of discounts and other reasons, then it's harder and harder to keep the doors open, which is what drives colleges and universities to looking at program cuts, to mergers with other organizations, and of course to closures. Now, these have been happening at a pretty steady rate, and I don't think they're they're really adequately appreciated, especially what happens when a campus closes to a local community. But the cuts can still keep happening because we have such a large sector. And so there's quite a bit of cutting that can be done, which is a humanitarian disaster. And that's the second problem, is that we had this commitment to all the many benefits that you described to higher education. And now it looks like we'll just be doing less of that. We'll be producing fewer of these benefits. We will perhaps be producing less research. We'll be teaching fewer students. We'll be doing less in the way of service in all kinds of ways. I think the most benign way I can put this in macroeconomic terms is that this is a market correction, that American higher education overbuilt its capacity and it overshot the demand. And as a result, there is a correction happening. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons that we can tie into for this, but I think this is crucial for everyone working in higher education to understand, but also people outside. So you think about state politicians who are trying to figure out their post-secondary strategy, thinking about K through 12 guidance counselors, teachers who are trying to prepare students for life, thinking about federal officials, and thinking about the entire business and nonprofit world, which depends on college graduates for training, for preparation, as well as for HR sorting. And all of that, I think we've taken a big step back from. Which is awful. The conclusion of my book, I come up with ways whereby I think we can avoid this from continuing. I mean, we're living in the post-peak world. It already happened. And that's simply true. And what I advise the reader is, in many ways, paths forward that we can take that can help regrow, rebuild higher education. And it might be that we never regain that quantitative level again, that our improvements are qualitative. And qualitative improvements are lovely and wonderful. If we can improve, for example, the experience of students, especially marginalized students, if we can improve student retention, I mean, these are all simply good things that we can do.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the book, which people should check out when that comes out. There is also, of course, a pretty good chunk of time spent on AI. It's obviously, I was struck. I mean, as anyone who listens to my work knows, I'm big on narratives. Like how do we make sense of AI? What is it? Is it like a tutor? Is it like an assistant? Is it like how we kind of end up conceptualizing it matters? And also these broader things about how we conceptualize what higher ed's role and how AI fits into that. So I love your futurist's lens, which you are really one who is always sketching out various ways that things might go down. There's different scenarios that could play out, and in the book you talk about different ways of seeing AI that might emerge in our collective understanding of it, and that might mean different things for how higher ed develops. So there's this. I want to quote this one line in the book. You say, "Our sense of human identity, our notion of growth, our faith in progress are at stake. And two divergent schools of thoughts about them are emerging." And AI was like being talked about as a piece of that. What are these two divergent schools of thought emerging around about what education means in the age of generative AI?
Oh, absolutely. And so for the listeners who haven't had a chance to read the book, these are two different topics that I address. They appear focally in two different chapters, but also they get woven through the rest of the book. And this is an idea that I've called variously the struggle for the future, or the battle for the future. And the idea is that we have two emerging ideologies of thinking about the next century or the next 2 centuries. And they're based in part on how we think about the Industrial Revolution. I'm not trying to be pedantic or to dive into archaeological records here. It's simply that one school of thought holds that the past 200 years have been extraordinary as a triumph of progress, and we need to continue that. And you think about people like Mark Andreessen, who will say, more progress. You think about someone like the science fiction writer Neal Stephenson, who will say we need to keep building and growing more.
Yeah, in fact, Diamond Age, it predicted like an AI tutor of sorts in that novelist's take. Yeah.
Very famously, the Young Ladies Illustrated Primer. Right.
Yep. It's hard to quickly summarize that book by Neal Stephenson, but it is called Diamond Age, or A Young Lady's Illustrated Primer. And the novel features an AI tutor. And this is a book that came out in 1995.
You can think about quite a bit of speculative fiction. Think of Star Trek, for example, which imagines a future where we are much more than we are now, that we live longer, live better, we expand into space, we are richer, we are smarter, and all this.
It's an abundant world of the future.
Yes, and the abundance ideology is an example of this that people have been talking about. It's an example of this idea of we need to return to growth. And I've nicknamed this, the hypermodern idea. That we need to keep doing this. And the second is what a good friend of mine nicknamed the demodern school. And this says,
what is it, demodern?
Yes.
Demodern.
Yes. And it says, okay, hold on. All this progress has been great, but it's come at a terrible cost. We've created global warming, which is catastrophic. We've done horrible things to human beings in terms of colonialism, racism, and so on. And that what we should do now is just pause where all this growth right now and try and redress all the problems. My good friend Bill McKibben has a really, really interesting book on this called Falter, where he just recommends that we need to pause right now. We're in a great spot. Humankind is in many ways, by material ways, at our peak. So
we did it. Woo!
Yeah, it's tremendous. It's really astonishing. I mean, you can find there are all kinds of cliches. You can say that the average unemployed person in the United States lives better than medieval king, and so on. Okay, well then let's redress things. Let's solve global warming. Let's redress environmental damage. Let's take care of the horrible imbalances of sexism.
It's like that make everything qualitatively better. Right?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Now, there's a spin-off of the demodern school, which says that this is a lovely idea, but we're not going to be able to make the choice. The choice is already being made for us because we have overshot the Earth's carrying capacity. We've caused terrible damages. We're in for a gigantic reset and crash right now. And you can find obviously cranks who say this, but what I'm thinking of is wonderful scholars like Machado, who wrote Hospicing Modernity. You can think about some of the darker visions of Kim Stanley Robinson. You could think about the Dark Mountain Project and say, look, we don't get to make a choice of this. We're already hitting it. I mean, in the past week, you've probably heard that it looks like we've passed the first tipping point in terms of bleaching of coral reefs around the world, that we've crashed through the 1.5 degree temperature rise. So it's not just ethically the right thing to do to pause and redo all of this, but it's also we're going to be forced to do it whether we like it or not. And the banner for this might be Ed Abbey's famous line that growth for growth's sake is the ideology of the cancer cell. And what follows from that is things like degrowth or donut economics or no growth, where you say, all right, instead of growing things with GDP, let's redistribute things instead. Or maybe we should cut back. We should teach people to be less in the way of consumerists, or we should just get used to what will be a darker time. I put these two schools of thought out there because I find them not fully articulated by almost anybody, but I see them present and woven through all kinds of parts of human life. And when we take a look at the AI sector, they're definitely in the hypermodernist side. There are a lot of utopian claims. We're going to use all this generative AI to improve the human condition in 1,000 ways.
To Star Trek it up, right? To boldly go.
Exactly. I would go even further. There's a wonderful series of science fiction novels by the great Scots science fiction writer Ian Banks called the Culture series, where humanity spreads through the galaxy, and they're utopian stories that we're just simply better off. And in those stories, benign artificial intelligences with a sense of humor get to help keep us going and keep us aloof. There's actually a real world echo of that. The starships in the Culture series all have very funny names, and Elon Musk has borrowed some of those names for the barges that he uses to catch SpaceX boosters coming back to Earth.
So he's reading these novels, or somebody in his team.
Yeah, because they're fascinating books and they're very important, but they give us that vision of that. And AI can do this. This goes to the argument. And then
Sure.
And then some of the opposition to AI will say, well, it will come back in that demodernist point of view, saying, well, this is pointless growth. This is dangerous growth. This is growth that is going to have environmental impacts in terms of water and electricity. This is growth that's going to degrade the human condition. This is cancerous. And others will go further, say, this is fascistic, this is eugenicist, this is colonialist, and so on. So you could see that divide begin to happen and play out in terms of AI. But not just in AI, in terms of higher education, the past 30, 40 years of extraordinary growth is an example of that hypermodernist idea. The more knowledge, the better. The more people with more college experience, the better. The more colleges and universities, the better for everybody. And now we are living through the demodernist reaction to that. Not necessarily consciously, but we are shrinking American higher education. And the question going forward is, first of all, how do we fit ourselves in this situation? Our scholars produce research that fits into both schools of thought. We have environmentalists, we have economists who can produce recipes for more growth or for no growth. We have people who do this in sociology and psychology and history and so on. But also our institutions, we have to think, is it time for us to grow any longer? I was talking to some folks from a European university that they made me say I couldn't repeat on air. And they said that they were turning down a massive donor's gift because the donor's gift would have gone for a new residence hall and they had no need for it.
Wow.
I thought, well, that's almost, I can see the shocked expression in your face. That's counterintuitive. Malcolm Gladwell a few years ago did that famous interview with, I believe, a Stanford president.
Yes, I heard that one.
I'll just take all gifts, more and more and more.
It was like the most gifted university wants more gifts. That was the kind of gist. It's like, wow.
Exactly. We can't turn it down. But this university told me that they couldn't actually people the residence hall, right? It would be a waste. And if you think as well, if you go further and think of the carbon footprint involved in the construction and the maintenance of it, that might not be a bad idea. And if this scenario is correct, there's a big if. I mean, this is all conditional. We're talking about a very, very complex organism, just American higher education, not to mention the whole world. If this is true, if we are still past peak, and if that continues into the future, then it means some colleges and universities are not going to be able to grow. And they may have to retrench and redesign for smaller numbers. So instead of 5,000 students, they have 4,000. A small liberal arts college with 1,200 goes down to 900. And they have to figure out how to do that deliberately. I have one chapter called Managed Dissent, which is a way of thinking about that. I'm not saying this with any glee. I mean, I think in many ways I'm a hypermodernist. For me, the more higher education, but looking at reality as it is, I think we're seeing this great struggle for the future begin to play out in our colleges and universities.
After the break, Brian tries to round up academics around the country to brainstorm a new model of higher ed with AI in mind. And Brian and I compare notes about how we use AI in our own work. Stay with us. Hey, everybody. I wanted to tell you about another podcast that I think you'll enjoy. College Matters from the Chronicle. College Matters is a weekly show from the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it's a great resource for news and analysis about colleges and universities. The host, Jack Stripling, is my former colleague at the Chronicle, who has covered and investigated higher ed for 2 decades. Jack really knows his stuff, and I think you'll get a kick out of his conversations with reporters and newsmakers. So check out College Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now back to the episode. So let's dig into AI. In fact, I was struck and we could talk a little bit about the book woven into this, but recently you have your great Future Trends Forum, which has been running for how many years and numbers now? It's like incredible. How long have you been doing the Future Trends Forum?
We're coming up on our 10th year in a couple of months.
10th year of these Thursday Zoom sessions. You have like a huge following. I've tuned in. I've had the honor to tune in from time to time over the years, and it's incredible. And your most recent one, or a recent one by the time people hear this, was on how to rethink college, or the higher ed, with AI in mind, which we did an episode with that pretty much title here on Learning Curve, but not at all the end of my covering it. It's kind of one of the big questions of this podcast. What could you just kind of talk about why you wanted to do that? And I think you might be doing more of that, and what your takeaways were from this initial brainstorm with so many, 70, 80 plus smart people you had from all over the sector talking about it.
Sure, happy to. And for those listeners who haven't seen the forum, this is a weekly video conversation about the future of higher education. And the usual pattern is one or a couple of bright guests, wonderful journalists, like, say, my fine host right now, with a piece of the puzzle of higher ed. And what happens is I connect them with dozens or hundreds of people in the audience, and we have an organic, free-flowing conversation without any presentation, no slides.
And anyone can kind of open their mic and participate. Like, you have moments where you're like, let's join. It's not one of these like raise your hand on the button. Yeah, it's very interactive. It feels like we're in a group together.
No, thank you. Thank you. That's what I want to achieve. I don't want it to be a canned presentation. I don't want it to be a simple discussion between me and the guest. I mean, I do a little of that to start off with, but I'm much more interested in the questions and comments that the audience brings up, and the audience is wonderful. But every so often we break from that pattern and we do something that's more of a design exercise where we try to build something, and sometimes I give people a scenario and they have to respond to it, and these are a lot of fun to do. So the exercise that you were just talking about, Jeff, was I gave them the charge that they have to redesign a college or university. And it might be called something else too. It might be an institute or an academy or some other name, but they have to start from scratch, and they have to start right now based on what we know about AI as it is. So we can't assume, say, artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence right now. We can't go back in time before ChatGPT 3.0. We have to assume where it is right now. And I asked them, well, what kind of post-secondary entity would you design? And what are some of the details of it? And the conversation that followed was brilliant, but it didn't really answer the question. What happened was we had a lot of conversation about all the different details, but there was so much to be worked out about those details that it really took up most of the time. So thinking about everything from, do we need face-to-face classes if we have powerful large language models? If so, how do we construct them? What happens to cheating, which is, of course, an unsolved and very, very large question. How do we think about online learning, distance learning, for example? How do we take care of assessment? How do we fund this? What happens when you're working with a corporation that you might find repellent? And all of these topics, just kind of bubbled away, and you could see the glimpses of some different possibilities. A few minutes ago, you mentioned Stephenson's Young Ladies Illustrated Primer. If listeners haven't read the book, it's a terrific idea, basically about a smart book, kind of a Kindle plus AGI.
And this was a book that came out in the 80s or 90s. It was a long time ago.
Yeah. And this is a kind of holy grail for some people in instructional design. But basically, it becomes a smart companion to an orphan girl and helps her grow and develop in ways that I won't spoil because it's delightful.
Yeah,
I actually tried to excerpt just those parts of the novel for one of my classes, and it was too completely interwoven, so I couldn't do that. But that's one possibility. Do we get students who a college assigns them a tutor? So we have the Jeff Young bot that will help the 18-year-old or any adult. And if so, but if those are commercially available, then it becomes a question of, do we compete with jeffyoungbot.com? Or do we have students who show up with these bots that have been companions to them for, if they're adult learners, through their adult life, or if they're traditional age undergraduates from their high school and earlier lives. If so, how do you structure this? Do you have one companion? Does that become, say, a kind of generic companion that an institution has for everybody, or do they become hyper-personalized? How do you handle personalization? So we had some interesting discussions about the politics of personalized learning, pro and con. And of course, there are all kinds of issues about what some would call harms. How do you control an AI so that it doesn't talk you into suicide or into mania? How do you keep it from confronting a student with the content which might injure them psychologically, and so on. So there are quite a few discussions about this, and I'd like to have a sequel session where we ground this a little bit further. And I'm still brainstorming how to do that.
This Zoom brainstorming session that Brian led, it was so classically academic in that people were encouraged to just throw any idea out there and try to work through these thorny issues without any commercial agenda or the idea that they would somehow benefit from it. It was all about what is the best way to organize a college in the age of AI. But Brian is increasingly worried that it might be getting harder to have this kind of open dialogue about whether and how to adopt AI in education.
The one thing I've been tracking, anticipating, and to an extent fearing is that the culture wars will come for AI in a big way. I mean, we've already seen the Republicans are generally speaking very, very pro AI. Trump is, Project 2025 was, a lot of Republicans are, and there are exceptions. Josh Hawley is passionately anti-AI. And he's done so religiously, literally with religious arguments. But overall, the Republicans seem to be very pro-AI. And a lot of the...
And J.D. Vance spent some time in this world of venture and some tech kind of world.
Yeah, and his connection with Peter Thiel. I mean, you've got that lineup. Meanwhile, a lot of the criticisms of AI come from a progressive point of view. Think about criticizing AI for reinscribing bias based on gender, race, region, ethnicity. You think about charges that AI is bad for labor in different ways, that it uses labor cruelly to create guardrails, that it may have a devastating impact on labor, as we were just talking about, but could also de-skill current employees working away. Again, this is a very progressive, indeed left point of view. You think about the criticism of a generative AI using way too much water and using way too much
the environmental charge.
That's classic on the left right now, right? So do we? In my imagination, I think sometimes that the Democrats had to make a choice between two parts of California to support. If they're going to support the North, Silicon Valley, or the South, Los Angeles and Hollywood. And in my schematic, in my cartoon in my mind's eye, I think they decided for Hollywood. But and you saw that shift actually in reality happen. The Obama administration was very, very pro Silicon Valley, and Hillary Clinton was. And then after 2016, that embrace pulled back. Biden wasn't very interested in supporting Silicon Valley, and now, of course, some Silicon Valley leaders have plumped for Trump in very public ways. So does this then become a culture war where the Democrats openly say, look, AI is catastrophic. We have to stop it for all these reasons. And then that plays out in our campuses in some interesting ways. So I had to cram all this into basically one chapter of this short book. And I try to do it in part, as you say, by storytelling, giving different scenarios for how this could play out.
Let's talk about this. Okay, so if AI becomes a polarizing topic, it's so many things seem polarizing these days and polarized, and that's it's very hard then to have these interesting discussions, like open and frank discussions about which path would lead to what and what do we want to do collectively. But since polarization seems to be, if AI gets caught up in that, what do you think is at stake there? Like what is your scenario for that if it happens that way?
Well, right now, we already have a very divided landscape in higher education. We have a good number of people, often in the humanities, who view AI as horrendous.
Well, anti-human in a lot of ways too, right? And not just the environmental, but it is tied up in Silicon Valley in this arguments from the people that I've heard make that case. Yeah.
Sure. You get the people in Silicon Valley who say, I've never read a book. I have no interest in doing so. And you have humanities scholars and practitioners, people who teach writing, for example, who will say, this is just devastating our students' ability to work and our ability to teach. And you have people from other sectors of knowledge across the disciplines as well. But that opposition is there. It can be very intense, very vocal. I can tell you a whole bunch of stories about folks I've talked with about this or protests that I've seen. I had one friend who told a colleague that he was going across campus to an AI workshop, and the other professors said, "Don't. We're leading a boycott against the workshop." Okay, I mean, I don't remember that kind of thing happening with Wikipedia, but
or other tools for online learning or something.
Yeah, this is much more intense. And then there are proponents, but I find the proponents are often much more muted, and they're distributed in different ways. You often have people, say, in career services or people at the top of the administration, VPs, presidents, board members, or state governments who are saying, well, this is happening across the labor sector. There's more AI, so students need to learn about this. You do have some passionate enthusiasts who will sometimes, create new GPTs or new classes or even new startups. But I think between the two of them, that there's already a great deal of friction. And quite a few campuses that I've worked with have told me about ways they're trying to navigate this, to have conversations that are productive and respectful. if this goes further, if this becomes a true culture war, if we have, say, Senator Schumer say, we need to stop OpenAI, and when in 2026, when we have congressional elections, maybe some of that will turn on opposition to AI, trying to get out voters for that, people who don't like data centers and so on. Then this will heighten the conflict on campuses. It'll be more challenging to do things like, if you want to promote an AI literacy program in your campus, that might become more difficult. People say, well, that's brutally wrong. We shouldn't be doing it. And so it could heighten, especially if we see any kind of popular movement against AI. I live in Northern Virginia, and this is kind of the ground zero for data center build out.
That's right. Yeah, there's that corridor that AOL sort of like founded at.
Yeah. Well, I bike to a gym every 2 days. It's about 3 miles away, and I go past several data centers that are either finished or still under construction. And there are different neighborhoods where people have bottom up protested against this in different ways and in different reasons. If that kind of organic protest grows, and if the Democratic Party, supports this and try to run with it, then maybe we have a greater conflict across higher education. And you could see this playing out in some interesting ways. There's a great body of scholarship now, a whole bunch of critical, skeptical, or downright hostile books to AI that are available in different formats. And it's, there are all kinds of ways this could play out, but at the very least, the greater intensity of conflict.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me from this this part of the conversation and this part of your book that there is something different about AI as it's playing out for the higher ed sector, and the question for each individual faculty member on whether and how to adopt it, and for an institution on whether and how to respond, I guess, to all these forces that we've talked about.
This is by far the most divisive technology of my adult life.
Wow.
I would have thought nuclear power, but actually that became pretty quiet, and seems like now. But nuclear power for electricity, not for weapons. It seems now that there's kind of a national consensus quietly in favor of it in the U.S. But there's nothing like this that I've seen. Not the popularization of the internet or the web. Not even the Wikipedia wars are kind of entertaining to look back on now.
Well, and there's social media more recently, but this is different even than that.
But I think what might be happening is that people's anxiety about social media, which really hasn't translated that much into not using it. One of the things I love is people using social media to complain about social media. But
can I get the next platform after Twitter to complain, to do exactly what I used to do on Twitter? Is that what you mean?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Well, I've had people say, well, I'm not going to use Facebook anymore. I think it's terrible. I'm going to go to Instagram. Well, just bad news for you. It's owned by the same people. Right? But I think there's still a lot of anxiety about that. And I think that's positioned now with AI. For some people, this will be combined. They're worried about what they may have seen as Facebook in terms of the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2016. They may dislike certain tech bros like Musk or Zuckerberg, and then AI becomes a kind of cathexis for this, where this is the biggest, boldest thing now coming out of Silicon Valley, and all right, well, now I'm going to stop. Now I'm going to block this from happening. I'm not going to go for this. And it's very, very difficult. That kind of refusal is really challenging, because it's one thing to say, all right, I'm not going to open Perplexity and use it, but using Google search, which is still the world's leading search engine, has it baked in. Using Google applications, which have generative AI baked in. The same with Microsoft, and tool after tool gets more and more AI-ified. So I think this is very challenging for higher education, and it's hard to find something practical to do about it too. I mean, if you want to block access to AI sites on your campus, you can only do that at the network level, but you can't do that through phones, which are ubiquitous.
Tom Friedman, who I found out is a Minnesotan, but Tom Friedman has a column recently where he called it the age of vapor. It was in the context of this war for AI between China and the U.S., the war for kind of winning AI. But he mentioned that this it's a technology that's like vapor, in that it's just everywhere, and it's going to be difficult. So it's this, like, AI will be so infused in what we do that boycotting it will be quite difficult. And And it will make a difference which platforms we end up using or which dominant kind of providers emerge, if I understood it correctly.
Well, it does. And one of the ways this appears is by trying to teach teaching critical literacy or teaching ethics. And sometimes people will use that as a method of resisting, based on the idea that otherwise, if that's not done, students are likely to either accept the technology uncritically, or they're likely to fall victim of hype. And then folks like Anna Mills or Nate Angel or Maha Bali, who you had on your show,
Yes.
it will say, well, if we have the technology, here are the ways you can think about it in ways that push back. That don't accept it on its own terms, that probe it and use it in different ways. And that's one of the great strengths of academia, is we have the intellectual horsepower to do that. We have the capacity. And through our teaching mission, we have that connection. And through our research mission, we can publicize that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the trick of not embracing it or not at all adopting it or using it. And it's even these words are so loaded as I say them. But, to sort of try to ignore or refuse AI completely then doesn't prepare students. Then they're just going to get, I guess, whatever the commercial version of the message around what to do with it, without a critical lens potentially.
Yes, I mean you could think of. I mean, years ago I came up with my scenario of the retro campus, right? The campus that tries to push back and offer an experience independent of modern digital life. And audiences often smile ruefully at that. And I've had CIOs say, that's not too bad sounding.
Right. They're like, ooh, take me there for a minute.
That's right. That's right. But there are a lot of things that we don't want to do with that. And one of the things when I teach educational technology workshops, I often ask people who seem uncomfortable. So by people, I mean faculty or staff, where they use digital technology in their personal lives outside of the classroom, outside of the campus. And almost inevitably, you get a rush of suggestions. People using online banking, people using online voting. People are playing games, they're watching Netflix.
Things people like about it. Yeah,
yeah, and they either like or they find very, very useful.
Sure.
Most people don't like online banking, but they find it useful as
right.
It's kind of like Microsoft, right? You don't get fans, but people simply use it, right? And that often warms them up, and they're like, okay, well, here now we use some technologies for teaching and learning and for research, and all right, that's a little more comfortable. You can connect with that. I mean, it may be that AI becomes. I mean, there's some interesting ways this could play out culturally. I mean, one of them is you think about declaring how much of your work is AI related. I've seen newsletters will do that. Well, this newsletter is 100% human or 90% human. There's a Japanese author, I'm blanking her name, who just got some controversy for admitting that her most recent novel, that she used AI for a chunk of the writing.
Right.
And I mean, I don't read Japanese, so I believe she composed in Japanese. So I don't know if I could assess that myself, but I do know that when I read some people's writing, that part of my brain will scope it to see what looks like ChatGPT generated or Gemini generated and so on. So perhaps we declare that, or perhaps as a third party, which assigns a label. So Jeff Young's podcast, 100% human, or season 2.
Experimented with, and it's funny. I try to do a little bit of that in my show. Like I mentioned, that the show Art is an experiment with trying AI. I will at this point. I think is worth sharing because I was wondering whether I would disclose this, but I think the spirit of disclosure is right here. Like for this episode, I did not have time, just like pure time, to read your whole book. I read the section on AI and was able to search in and make sure I keyed in on the parts where you talked about AI and sit down and really read that. But I haven't, I had Notebook LM create a podcast, a 15-minute podcast summarizing the whole book to give me a sense of the argument. And then I took that and dug into some other parts that I knew that I was interested in. And so I used it as a way to highlight which parts of your book I would have in my limited amount of time that I would read completely. But
I think this is completely widespread. I think this happens just about everywhere right now to some degree or other.
I had actually never done that before. I'd never used Notebook LM for the podcast feature.
Notebook LM is
that was new to me as far as trying it. But I feel very careful when I'm doing anything because I feel like my profession's at stake so much and so much of what I do. I certainly don't, if I had my preference, I would have sat down and read your whole book before we talked, or at least skimmed it as I've had to do before Notebook LM came out.
Well, perhaps this goes back to another part of the demodernist point of view, which is to say we need a slower life, like slow food, slow teaching, where we need to have time to read an extraordinary book by your best friend, Brian Alexander. And I think a lot of people would think, oh, that's very appealing, actually. I have to say, by the way, I use Notebook LM on this book too. When I finished the complete draft that I was turning to the publisher, and I uploaded to Notebook LM, and then immediately Notebook LM gave me the podcast for about 12 minutes long.
Oh, interesting.
Which was terrific for me as a writer, because basically I had a reader.
So it's like, did the takeaways from that equal what you'd hoped? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, that was what was useful, was I could see, all right, they hit the highlights that I wanted readers to have. And then they found a couple of things that I didn't think I emphasized that much. And it was interesting to say, okay.
This might be hard to picture if you have not used this AI tool. So I'm going to play you an excerpt. Again, what I did was I fed Brian Alexander's new book into this AI tool, and then it had 2 AI-generated podcasters deliver a 12-minute analysis of highlights. I'd say this tech is more realistic than the example of video avatars of professors at UVA that we featured a couple episodes ago. And when you hear these synthetic podcasters refer to the sources, they just mean whatever I fed into it, which again, in this case, is just Brian Alexander's book, Peak Higher Ed. So here is that sample.
It really feels like institutions are at this strategic fork in the road. They have to place a bet, right? Either lean into that hyper-modern future growth tech expansion, or navigate the demodern path, maybe smaller, more focused on repair, contraction.
That really seems to be the critical choice emerging from the sources. The statistical decline, the peak being behind us, that's now colliding head-on with these massive challenges, AI, climate, these deep ideological fights. The stakes just feel incredibly high right now for the whole sector.
But they didn't mention one thing, so I went back to the manuscript and poked and brought it around.
I love that. I want to cut in here again to underline how surprising this was to me. If I understand Brian correctly, he heard a summary of his book from this AI tool, and then he went back to his text and tweaked it to make sure that the points that he wanted to come through were clear to the robot reader. I have to admit, it sounds kind of cool. But is this a good thing? I mean, should I have used this tool to help prepare for the interview? And should Brian be using the bot to essentially shape his book? Maybe it truly made his book better. Maybe it made the podcast better. Or maybe both would have been somehow more human the other way.
The Notebook LM also generated a concept map, which was really actually pretty good. I mean, the way it came out.
Oh, I didn't notice that feature. I didn't use that. Okay.
And it generated 2 learning materials, generated a quiz for my book, which was great. And this is without me prompting. This is just out of the box.
Right.
I mean, Notebook LM, I think, is extraordinary, literally extraordinary. There's no competition for it. No other, OpenAI doesn't have one. Nobody else has done a startup. It's so far it's unique, but
Google must just know more. It's just data set must be better. I don't know, for it to be able to do that.
I know some of the folks who did this, and they're really extraordinary folks, including they're also very humanities oriented. One told me he was a huge fan of Borges and wanted to have a kind of Borgesian experience. But let me ask you this, as a podcasting person, what speed do you listen to the podcast at?
I only listen at regular speed. I know I've heard that I'm better at double or 1.5 because I can tend to be a little bit, some people are already oh my God, 1.5 please at least. But I'm going to stick with my human delivery, and people can have that button.
My brilliant colleague at Georgetown, Dewan Stanford, he listened. We have a divide on this. He listens.
Really?
He listens to things at 3 speed.
Holy moly!
Which I find almost incomprehensible. And I'm with you. I love radio. I love podcasts. So
I listen at regular speed. So you do it play out.
Yeah, 1.0. Yeah.
1.0. That's me.
But again, this is personalization, and we could talk about it for a while. But I think and this breaks out the question of pro or anti AI into some questions of nuance. So you think about, for example, if you have a very busy student, say an adult learner who has a full-time job,
or they're taking care of a family member or something, right? There's something they can't avoid.
Well, then the podcast generator may come in very, very handy, because one of the great things about podcasts and audio in general is you can multitask easily. When you're walking the dog, when you're doing dishes, when you're driving in traffic, you can do that. But you cannot do with video, or you shouldn't do with video. And you can't do with reading unless you take text and dump it into AI or something like Speechify. So then does that be, I found over the past few years that a good chunk of my students prefer listening to audiobook versions of our readings. And it fits into their lives, which I completely understand. And then we could think, this will lead some listeners into thinking about learning styles, which I want to avoid. But you can see how this can, lead into all kinds of things. So someone who has a really nice voice like you, Jeff, do you now have an advantage in if you record your own audio for your students versus somebody has a terrible scratchy voice? Well, there'd be a disadvantage, right?
Or do we all get replaced by AI voices? Because the ones in Google Notebook LM, this auto podcast that it spins up that are totally AI generated, are pretty soothing
really
and
good.
delightful.
They're really good.
That's the scariest part of that feature. It's almost like why I don't even want to use it. It's basically like, it is doing what I do, and this sounds great. Brian, I could talk to you for sure all day. Thank you for this, this book, which I hope to get some time to actually read and not just have Google LM summarize. But this is a really interesting argument that you're making, and it seems very timely to think about where was higher ed going already before AI's here, and all the forces that have come in the last year with Trump and politics, but all these things that were already well in play, and then what kind of scenarios could play out, and which ones do we want to encourage and why, and how is higher ed fit into our culture? How do we want it to, and how does AI take part of that? So all kinds of rich stuff to explore.
Well, thank you. That's what I want to leave the reader with, is that sense of agency. After having a tour of the landscape, both recent history and looking forward to the future, to give a sense of possibility, of options. Okay, now you know the terrain better. Now you know the stakes and some of the possibilities. Now we can actually choose how to redesign and rethink higher education. That's an incredible opportunity, as well as quite a challenge. But I hope readers feel that they can do that.
All right. Well, thanks. I hope we talk again soon. Good to see you, Brian.
My pleasure, Jeff. Take care.
This has been Learning Curve. I am always curious to hear your thoughts. Are you using AI tools in your work? And if so, how do you feel about it? And what rules do you set for yourself about when and how to use them? Send me a note to jeff@learningcurve.fm, and I might feature your comments on a future episode or call you up to hear more. If you like the show, please tell a friend about Learning Curve or share it on social media. You can sign up for our newsletter or become a financial supporter at learningcurve.fm. This episode was put together by me, Jeff Young. The episode art was created by the AI tool Midjourney, and the music is by Kamaku. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, if you haven't caught the past episodes, you can binge those. I especially recommend the one I did last week with some student journalists. It was a lot of fun. Until then, thank you for listening.